I'm just going to talk for about 20 or 30 minutes about the book, and I had my publisher send down some copies, which I hope some of you got, Death of the Liberal Class, because it really is an attempt to explain what happened to popular movements, how we ended up where we are, and what went wrong, and why is it that the mechanisms within the formal structures of authority have failed to push through piecemeal and incremental reform, as well as protect those pieces of legislation, whether it was Glass-Steagall or anything else, that were put in place to prevent the kind of crisis that is now descended upon us. And I think it really goes back to World War I. Just as a sort of segue into it, I should say that the book, when I wrote it, originally was a book on the press. It wasn't my idea to write a book about the press. It was an editor at Knopf, and if there are any writers amongst you, it was a really good abject, or sort of, it was a good lesson into why you should never write somebody else's idea. They didn't give me much money, enough that I could write, and I make my living off of my advances, to write it. I gave a talk at the Ford Foundation, and Ford said that they would give me a grant, so I sort of went ahead and wrote it up, and when I turned it into Knopf, the editors read it and hated it, and volunteered to publish it after they had assigned someone in-house to excise all what they call the negativity out of the book. What they wanted was that mythical version of the press without fear and favor, Watergate, the Pentagon Papers. And while I am certainly a defender of the mainstream press and worried about its demise, I also understand its faults far better than the editors of Knopf. So at some financial loss, I refused to let them publish the manuscript, found a publisher that would take it without excising the negativity, which was Nation Books. But in that transition, realized that it wasn't just the press that had collapsed, but all of the pillars of the liberal establishment that had collapsed. The liberal church, which I come out of, my father was a Presbyterian minister, very involved in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement. He himself was a veteran from World War II. He'd been a sergeant in North Africa. And finally, the gay rights movement. His brother, his youngest brother, my uncle, was gay. And my father had a particular sensitivity to the pain of being a gay man in America in the 1950s and the 1960s. And I think the church, the institutional church, was least forgiving for that stance. To stand up and call for gender equality in the 1970s was a very courageous and radical measure on his part. And I always tell this story. My son, who's here today, senior at Colgate, has heard it more times than he wants. But I also went to Colgate, and my father at the time had a church in Syracuse, New York, and when he found that there was no gay and lesbian organization at Colgate, he brought the gay speakers down to the campus, and I would have to sit around groups not much larger than this with my dad and gay activists talking about other ways of being and dignity and respect. I will confess that I was probably one of the most committed heterosexuals at Colgate. This led to my going into the dining hall, and the checker would take my card and check it off for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, and hand it back with the words, "faggot." So I made it my undergraduate mission to seduce his girlfriend. My mother didn't like me to tell this. So the liberal church, I'm not sure there'd even be a place for my father anymore in the Presbyterian church. Labor, of course, education, the corporatization of education, and not just simply in terms of for-profit universities and the destruction of liberal arts and the humanities, which of course are about teaching people how to think rather than what to think. But even among the elite institutions, some of which I have taught at, Princeton, Columbia, NYU, I taught at the University of Toronto last year. We are seeing a very frightening destruction of those processes by which people are taught critical thinking. Everybody is conditioned, even at the elite levels, to become systems managers of the system and not question it. So that by the time you arrive at a place like Princeton or Harvard, you have been essentially vetted through standardized testing and GPAs and enrichment programs and AP courses to be utterly deferential to authority, worse than deferential, to really achieve your sense of self and identity through what authority says about you, what they think about you. And these are exactly the kind of people corporations want. People with strong work ethic, a kind of narrow analytical intelligence, who have no sort of moral fiber to stand up and confront figures. The university had given me a pass because I was giving a lecture. And after I gave my talk, I announced to the sponsors of the lecture, the humanities department, that I would not be sleeping in the faculty club, but I would be sleeping in one of the tents with the occupied students. And I mentioned there was no curfew imposed on my Harvard pass, so I couldn't be in Harvard Yard at 3 in the morning on the date that I was giving the talk. And I subsequently found out from a friend of mine who teaches at Harvard that there was a meeting of the deans to decide whether or not they should expel me. You'd think they'd have something better to do. And they finally decided to let me stay, and I guess I obey them, so I did spend the night there. But even universities, which should be places where a range of voices, legitimate dissent, is not only tolerated but actually fostered and encouraged. Culture. My wife's an actor, classical actor, went to Juilliard, and so we're very tied into the theater scene in New York, and serious theater has just been utterly pushed to the margins. The complete commercialization, destruction of culture, culture being that which has the capacity to transform, not entertain, the capacity to make you see yourself through the eyes of the other. To ask those questions that before you went into the theater you didn't ask before, is being eviscerated, Disneyfied. And I'm not even going to get into popular culture on electronic media like television. So all of these pillars had collapsed. And I think the genesis of it really goes all the way back to World War I. And there's a wonderful writer who I recommend to all of you, if you haven't read him, Dwight MacDonald. And MacDonald writes that World War I was the rock on which progressive movements were broken. And MacDonald was right, because on the eve of World War I, we had powerful anarchist movements, Berkman, Goldman, a series of radical publications, whether it was the Masses or Appeal to Reason, or anarchist journals. We had the Wobblies, the old CIO, great intellectual figures like Jane Addams, Randolph Bourne. And what we saw in World War I was the power elite, and not utterly dissimilar to the culture we're in today, except the robber barons were confined within national borders. The current robber barons in today's global economy are precisely that, global, in that they don't respect national boundaries at all. Workers in the race to the bottom are forced to be competitive with women who work in sweatshops in Bangladesh and earn 22 cents an hour, or prison labor in China. It's a global neo-feudalism. But they were really on the run. They'd been discredited. There were huge popular movements against them. Debs, 1912, socialist candidate, polls 6% of the vote, 900,000 votes. You have about 36 socialist mayors in major cities in this country, including Milwaukee, Schenectady, other cities. And so, in 1912, Wilson runs for re-election on the platform he kept us out of the war. There was no popular support for World War I, the kind of collective suicide that Europe was engaged in. And with the collapse of Tsarist Russia and the possibility the Germans could transfer up to 100 divisions from the eastern to the western front, there became a possibility of a breakthrough and a defeat, a German and a French defeat. And this terrified Wall Street, which had lent tremendous sums to the British and the French government, and knew that their defeat would mean that those monies would never be repaid. So that, coupled with the Kaiser's decision to begin attempt to create a naval blockade around Britain and sink all shipping, including American shipping, pushed America into the war. And yet, there was very, very little support for the war. They quickly had to institute the draft because people didn't sign up. There was not any kind of patriotic upsurge to go off to Verdun or Flanders or Somme or anywhere else. And they created a very important institution, the ramifications of which are with us today, called the Committee for Public Information, popularly known as the Creel Commission, because it was headed by a former muckraking journalist named George Creel. And the dark, sort of grand inquisitor figure, brilliant, without question, but certainly deeply destructive to American democracy, is Walter Lippmann, who in this time period becomes, along with a small group of other intellectuals around Wilson, the driving force to the creation of the first system of modern mass propaganda. The Committee for Public Information, for the first time, employed the understanding of crowd psychology, mass psychology, pioneered by figures like Le Bon, Schroeder, Sigmund Freud, and others. And out of the Committee for Public Information comes figures like Edward Bernays, the father of modern public relations. Bernays, interestingly enough, being Freud's nephew through marriage twice over. So they grasp that populations are moved not by fact or reason, but by the skillful manipulation of emotion, what Lippmann calls the manufacturing of consent. And people like Lippmann, Wilson wants to go for the harsher measures of the Espionage Act, the Sedition Act, the old sort of forms of state control. And Lippmann and a guy named Ballard and others argue that no, mass propaganda will get the vast majority of Americans to unite behind the war effort. But more importantly, it will be used to destroy these radical movements, which were fiercely anti-war, of course. And Lippmann and others were right. And when you read Randolph Bourne, great writer, or Jane Addams, who were these kind of stalwarts who held out, one of the sort of constant themes within their writing is this despair that so many people have been seduced by this propaganda, including the intellectual class, that very, very few people, even old committed socialists, have been able to hold out against the sway. You have a film division created, which pretty much pays for itself, making trashy movies like The Kaiser, The Butcher of Berlin. You have a news division created, and every single newspaper now publishing in the country has to be pro-war, or it has to cease publication. So the masses shuts down. Appeal to Reason, which has the fourth highest circulation in the country, another socialist journal, has to run pro-war editorials. But all of it, and the press was far more diversified than it is today. Now it's been gobbled up by a handful of corporations, roughly about a half dozen. Whereas before you had ethnic presses, all sorts of diverse presses, but all of them had to run this pro-war propaganda, including in the news stories that were churned out by the news division, with the manufactured atrocities, all the stuff subsequently we understand. So it's very easy to marginalize these groups. And what happens after the war is that almost the instant the war is over, the dreaded Hun becomes the dreaded Red. And you see that final upsurge of radical activity and the harsh measures of the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act being employed to crush what's left of any kind of real popular resistance. That's how Joe Hill, the old Wobbly, gets executed in Utah. That's how Big Bill Haywood, one of the leaders of the Wobblies, is also on a trumped-up murder charge, flees, spends the last 10 years of his life in Moscow. It's how you get Alexander Berkman, Emma Goldman, and others deported. About 300 people deported to the Soviet Union, where they don't last very long under Lenin. And those publications, including Appeal to Reason, get shut down, even though they have supported the war. And what happens is that all of the architects of the Committee for Public Information transfer immediately to Madison Avenue and start working for corporations. And one of the sort of fascinating footnotes is that when Goebbels builds the propaganda movement for the Nazi machine, one of the seminal texts he carries is Edward Bernay's book, Propaganda. So we become a culture which sees corporations employ these very effective techniques of manipulation. And we have a transference, I think, at that point, or a destruction of what I would call American culture. Those old sort of qualities of self-effacement, thrift, hard work, and it's replaced with the hedonism, the cult of the self that corporations have pounded into us since the end of World War I. There's a wonderful book called Exiles by Malcolm Cowley, who I only knew because he was Faulkner's editor, but it's a really brilliant intellectual memoir of that period in which he makes much this point, that the kind of solidarity, the kind of self-sacrifice that made those movements possible are replaced by corporate culture. And I think what we call American culture is probably misnamed. I think, in fact, it is corporate culture. And at that point began a kind of death spiral, I think, for American democracy, because these radical movements are what kept the liberal class, these liberal institutions, honest. The liberal class was never designed to be the political left. The liberal center, Dostoevsky writes, by the way, quite a bit about this in his novel Demons, Notes from Underground. The kind of obsession of Dostoevsky. I mean, the Notes from Underground really is a book about the defeated dreamer, the person who went to all the Obama rallies and chanted, "Yes, we can," and now just is a cynic. It's Mouseman. And Dostoevsky understood that in an age where liberalism didn't work, you very easily barreled towards moral nihilism. Raskolnikov's dream at the end of Crime and Punishment also was about this. And he's right, that the liberal class makes incremental or piecemeal reform possible. It responds to popular pressure. But when you destroy the mechanisms for that pressure to be heard, and then, of course, with the Red Scare, with this kind of permanent war psychosis that gripped the country after World War I, you began to disembowel liberal institutions itself. So figures, traditional figures within the liberal establishment even, like Henry Wallace, Roosevelt's vice president, are tainted with being soft on communism and become political pariahs, which is what happened in Wallace's 1948 presidential bid. Conrad Black, when he writes his biography of Roosevelt, said that Roosevelt's greatest contribution, in the end, was that he saved capitalism. And I think that's right. And I think the corporate state is so myopic and so disconnected that they don't understand that vital element of the liberal class. It acts as a kind of safety valve, so that when there is pressure, popular pressure exerted by these movements, the liberal class can respond. That's what the New Deal is. It responds incrementally to relieve some of that pressure and save the system. But with the destruction of the popular movements, and of course the 1950s was the final sort of assault, where in the McCarthy hearings we saw thousands of university professors, journalists like I.F. Stone, become pariahs. So Stone can't even get a job at The Nation magazine and starts I.F. Stone's Weekly in the basement of his house with his wife. You have thousands of social workers. Social workers' unions used to advocate on behalf of their clients. Actors, of course, people in creative arts. It's interesting that the first, in the New Deal program, The first program that the right wing went after to destroy was the theater program, because you saw through the public theater powerful theatrical productions suddenly disseminated across the country that were freed from corporate control. It's how you end up with the great musical The Cradle Will Rock, which gets shut down in New York City, and because they understood how dangerous it was, the capacity of these art forms. And I think that we have to understand that there's not just been a political assault, but a cultural assault, and that reviving popular politics has to be accompanied with a revival of culture. Culture has been decimated. Real, true, authentic culture, the capacity by which we can become more cognizant of who we are and where we live and what we're about. This has been, of course, on the airwaves, utterly decimated into a kind of horrible collection of trivia and celebrity gossip and reality shows. And I read a book called Empire of Illusion, where I spent a lot of time talking about this. So the destruction of the popular movements and the disemboweling of the liberal class, so that even the ACLU, under figures like Sidney Hook and others, are carrying out witch hunts, with the rise of predatory corporate capitalism, left us utterly undefended. And you began to see, probably from the 1970s onward, this steady assault by corporate forces against all of the impediments, regulations, protections that had been put into place to create a life of dignity for American working men and women. And we shifted in the 70s, in the words of the Harvard historian Charles Mayer, from what he termed an empire of production to an empire of consumption, culminating with this kind of faux liberalism, figures like Clinton or Obama, which speak in that traditional feel-your-pain language of liberalism, and yet have walked out on every basic value of traditional liberalism. Clinton being sort of the poster child for it. It's Clinton that pushes through NAFTA, the greatest betrayal of the working class in this country since the Taft-Hartley Act of 1948. It's Clinton that destroys welfare. It's Clinton under Larry Summers that deregulates the banking system. Canada doesn't have a banking crisis because they never tore down the firewalls between commercial and investment banks. It's Clinton that deregulates the FCC, allowing Rupert Murdoch's News Corp and Clear Channel and other large right-wing corporations to essentially buy up the airwaves. So that roughly about a half dozen corporations, Viacom, General Electric, News Corp, Disney, control almost everything most Americans, probably 90% of Americans, see, watch, read, or hear. You can go onto the internet, but you have to be proactive. And the fact is the mass of Americans are passive receivers of information. They are not proactive. And it culminates with Obama. Obama is a figure who essentially codifies the destruction of international and domestic law that is put in place by the Bush administration. He hasn't even found it within him to restore habeas corpus. He supports the FISA Reform Act, which retroactively under our Constitution makes legal what has always been illegal, the warrantless wiretapping, monitoring, and eavesdropping of tens of millions of Americans. Of course, he has pushed through legislation to make it legal to assassinate American citizens, as he has with the cleric in Yemen. The Military Detentions Act, which also just went through. These are utterly terrifying measures of state control. And anybody who understands how despotic or totalitarian regimes work, go back and look at what was happening in Germany in 1933, and I think this is what leads intellectuals like Noam Chomsky to compare our present state to Weimar. The first thing they do is destroy the legal system. There's actually quite a fine book, memoir, written by Sebastian Hoffner called Defying Hitler. He was a lawyer in the law courts in 1933, and he saw precisely what the fascists did. That you walk in and you essentially make legal what before was illegal. And at that point, the state has the control to use those measures, as they will, as they have already with environmental activists and others. There's circumstantial evidence that Homeland Security was at least tangentially involved in the shutdown of the 18 Occupy movements. You end up with a situation whereby, in the name of the war on terror, in the name of Homeland Security, in the name of national security, we can all end up like Bradley Mann. And that's precisely where we've come to today. It's why, for me, the Occupy movement is absolutely vital, because the only weapon we have left is civil disobedience. And I don't have to tell anyone in this crowd, jail is not a pleasant experience. As I think the great moral voices, Wendell Berry or Bill McKibben and others have discovered, this is the only weapon left. Wendell, 77 years old, occupies along with other activists, the governor's office in Kentucky to fight mountaintop removal. And as Wendell Berry says, going to jail is more time than I care to donate to the U.S. government. But frankly, that is all we have left. That is why this movement for me is sort of the last best hope to protect what is left of our democracy and finally to save our ecosystem, because unfettered capitalism is a revolutionary force, as Karl Marx understood. It turns everything into a commodity. Human beings become commodities. The natural world becomes a commodity that it exploits until exhaustion or collapse, which is why the environmental crisis is intimately twinned to the economic crisis. And if you look at the latest climate science work, we have very, very little time left. So in many ways, it's not hyperbolic to say that this movement is on many, many profound levels a fight for life. And it's why I so enthusiastically and passionately support you and what you're doing. And I've got a court date. I'm trying to ration my court dates. I was arrested in front of Goldman Sachs. And when I get through that one, I promise to get another one. 15 minutes of questions.
Where are you going to get arrested again? January 20th?
No, I'm going to court on the 20th. I really let the, I'm very close to a lot of people at the Occupy Wall Street movement, so I haven't planned it out. I'm not going to tip them off. I think one of their actions, one of the actions, my friend Cornel West has been arrested with Occupy people on the stop and frisk issue, and so I may go up with Cornel if he does that again. Cornel's been great on this, by the way. We did a people's hearing of Goldman Sachs, Cornel and I, and then we walked over to Goldman. It's where I got arrested. But the night before, after we were planning it all out, several hours, Cornel and I went to dinner, and Cornel said to me, "Where are all these so-called intellectuals?"
I've read a lot of your columns, and it seemed to me that around 2010, the beginning, you started actually asking for more bodies in the way of things, and I don't know if I misread that. Clearly, that's what happened. I think you were calling for that, but I didn't know whether I was reading that right, or was it? Did you think there was any chance about this kind of program before that?
No, I did not foresee the Occupy movement, first of all, and not only that, although I did feel that, and I would agree with political philosophers like Sheldon Wolin, and his great book, Democracy Incorporated, I urge you all to read. I think it's the most prescient sort of critique of the power system as it exists in the United States. I did feel that civil disobedience was the only weapon, and which is why I was down in Washington with Veterans for Peace, Code Pink, and other groups getting arrested. But I didn't foresee the Occupy movement. I felt that we had a moral imperative to do it, whether it succeeded or not. But I've learned as much from the Occupy movement as I've given to it, if I've given it anything at all, in terms of how to organize that non-hierarchical organization. I'm really impressed with it, with what they've done. But yes, I did certainly, I think by 2010, I don't actually remember the date, but you're probably about right, did feel that, I didn't buy into the Obama stuff. I supported Nader in 2008, for which, at the time, at gatherings, even at Berkeley, I would be hissed and booed for getting up and saying that. I felt that Nader's, and Ralph knew he wasn't going to win. The idea was to build a block of 5 or 10 million people who would begin to stand up to these forces and begin to punish them for what they're doing, in particular the Democratic Party. And I felt that that was the proper tactic, a kind of obstructionist tactic. It works in Germany. I mean, the Labour Party in Germany never polls more than 5%, and yet it's a political force to be reckoned with. And I think that at this point, the differences between Republicans and Democrats, or Romney and Obama, are so minimal. It's what Freud called the narcissism of minor difference. And if we don't stop the corporate state, I mean, look, Obama should not be supported just for Durbin alone. Because I have kids. And that was the greatest betrayal of the next generation.
How about that? See if you can reflect on the relationship between strategy and race. The whole rising of the Occupy movement is not strategy. It's race in the sense of spontaneous. I guess I don't think there's any success in how much we can strategize against the firepower of corruption. So there's a tension between how you approach the revolution, this strategy, versus how you stay open to race.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, movements are mysterious forces, and I covered movements as a foreign correspondent. I covered all of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, or three of the major ones: Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and Romania. I covered all the street protests that brought down Milosevic. I've covered the Palestinian uprisings. And what is it that sparks them? How do they capture the popular imagination? Even the leaders, the people closest to those movements, don't understand. So that on November 9th, in the afternoon of November 9th, 1989, I'm with the leaders of the East German opposition in Leipzig, and they're talking about maybe within a year there'll be free passage back and forth across the Berlin Wall. Within a few hours, the Berlin Wall, at least as an impediment to human traffic, did not exist. And you can't know. It is, I'm not a Marxist and I don't like Lenin, but he's right on that. Lenin writes about this, that these are forces which take on a life of their own. And I think that's what the Occupy movement was. You use the term grace. We won't burden them with our divinity school talk, but grace is probably right. I mean, these things are not predictable, nor is the time frame. I mean, remember that everything that set the stage for 1917 in Russia happened in Petrograd in 1905. And remember the Russian Revolution, by the way, which I think a lot of people who don't read that period in history understand, was a bloodless revolution. The Tsar had to abdicate, not because of force. The armed push came later when Lenin and the Bolsheviks overthrew Kerensky and the Duma, and of course the anarchists, who were the great enemies of the Bolshevik Party, because they ran the Soviets, and Lenin wanted centralized control. But most revolutions, I mean, the power of opposition is often never seen at the time. So that when I'm in Prague, I was in Prague for the Velvet Revolution, meeting every night with Havel and all the others in the Magic Lantern Theater. And all through the streets of Prague that winter were posters of that young Charles University student who to protest the 1968 invasion, Soviet invasion, had lit himself on fire in Wenceslas Square and died 4 days later from his burns. Now, when the other students tried to carry out marching his funeral, they were blocked by police. When his grave became a shrine, they dug up his body, cremated it, gave his ashes to his mother, said she couldn't bury them in a cemetery. When he became a non-person, a complete news blackout, and yet, a couple of weeks after the communist regime fell, Havel was in Red Army Square renaming it in his honor. I stood in Wenceslas Square when the great singer, Marta, and I'll butcher her last name, Kubisha, I think it is, but she had sung the anthem of protest in 1968, and her recording stock was destroyed. She was not allowed to appear on the airwaves. She ended up supporting herself by working at an assembly line of a toy factory. And so I watched her, 500,000 people, I watched her walk out onto that balcony and begin singing that anthem. I was with a group of university students who knew every single word to that song and sang it with her, with the tears running down their cheeks.
What word can be used instead of grace that would be widely comprehensive?
What, I don't know. What word can be used instead of grace? Mystery, maybe. Mystery, yeah. But I think that it's important to remember that, and Havel writes about this, other great dissidents write about it, that no act of resistance is ever useless, what he calls living in truth. But it's a matter of keeping alive another narrative. And it always affects far more people than you suspect and see, because it exposes the mendacity and the corruption and the rot of the state or of the power elite. And this is something that before the Occupy movement I felt strongly, which is why those protests in Lafayette Park were important. Nobody ever pulled the numbers they wanted. It was the same 400 or 500 great souls who would show up. Every time they'd hold it, they'd think maybe this time they'd get a couple thousand. They never did, but it never mattered. Never mattered. And I can tell you, there's a beautiful video you did, which you can watch on YouTube, which he put together. It's snowing. Watermelon Slim is playing his harmonica, playing taps, himself a Vietnam vet. They're folding the flag, American flag of a young man who was just killed. His family had brought the flag in Afghanistan, I believe, or Iraq. I think it was Afghanistan. And then 131 people lined up. Most of them were vets. A lot of them are wearing their old uniforms, some from the Iraq War, some from the Afghan War, some from the Vietnam War. And somebody beats a drum. It's total silence, and they march in line to that fence. And for those of us who have spent much of our lives in war, and I as a war correspondent have, it was a deeply emotional moment. Many of us were crying. And I think one of the most moving moments of that was as several vets were arrested and getting those plastic cuffs put around their wrists behind their back. Police officers who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, the National Guard, would sort of whisper, "Keep doing what you're doing." You can never underestimate the power of rebellion when it's done with respect and dignity and nonviolence. And it's why they shut down these encampments, because this movement terrifies the power. It terrifies them. They're running very, very scared because they understand far better than you or I how utterly corrupt and game the system is. One more question.
I was wondering, I am almost an unemployable Presbyterian minister, and so I had affinity with your comment, and I did like the phrase grace. What do you feel is the role of the religious community? It seems to be balkanized, or that Sandy here, who's the protest chaplain, and I, who've been the protest chaplain. I mean, what you have written about this, but what do you see as the role of those sort of groups?
Well, I mean, the liberal church has failed us on so many issues in the name of tolerance, a word Martin Luther King never used. Why are we supposed to be tolerant of bigots? One of the reasons I walked out in the church is because I don't want to waste my energy arguing about whether gays or lesbians or bisexual or transgender people should be treated like human beings. I mean, if you're caught up in that argument, then you can rot in your church basement with everyone else. The church has failed to confront corporate capitalism. The church has failed to confront the Christian right. These people aren't Christians, they're heretics. They have acculturated the worst aspects of American imperialism and capitalism into the Christian gospel and expected us to treat it as a legitimate form of faith. I have no idea why people, as I did, spent 3 years in divinity school and seminary and then walked out in the wider world and didn't think we'd have to fight for the radical message of the gospel. But they didn't, and so the church has nothing to say. And frankly, I think the last hope for the church is that it embraces the Occupy movement, which I think has its unofficial credo the Beatitudes. The paralysis of the church is barreling it towards utter irrelevancy. And in East Germany, the church was awake and vital to the occupation, and in Czechoslovakia, with the exception of that great 90-year-old cardinal, was largely irrelevant. In Poland, of course, so it depends on, the church has a very spotty record. In, much of the opposition in Romania was led by Hungarian priests from Timișoara, but even within its own denomination, they actually banished one of the major leaders out of Timișoara. I mean, the institutional church was completely pro-regime. So I feel that, what's good about the church I care about, but I don't see the church responding. And look, one of the most egregious examples of how corrupt the church has become is Trinity Church in New York, which is just a corporation masquerading as a church. It has $30 billion worth of property. Its tenant, by the way, is Goldman Sachs, one of its tenants. It pulls in $30 million a year. The rector, Cooper, at Trinity makes a salary of $1.2 million. And after his name rector, he's also CEO of the Trinity Corporation. I mean, this is just obscene. This has nothing to do with the Christian gospel. And, of course, they have a plot of land that they have to develop for God knows what reason, and that they've locked the Occupy out. My great friend, Bishop George Packard, you go watch him in his purple Cossack leaping over that fence. I told George, first of all, he's probably the only Christian bishop in America, but second of all, that act alone is sort of, redeemed what's left of the church that my father cared about and that I care about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris Hedges. That's always great. Dr. King called the churches the brake lights, not the headlights. So I think that's not a short-term problem you got to deal with. Freedom Plaza, by the way, doesn't get as many visitors as usual when it's warm out. So if you are able to donate, please do. And we could use the support. This camp takes money to run, and so we appreciate that.